The scent of ionized copper and panicked sweat filled the sterile air of the concourse. They thought he was just a ceremonial accessory, a glorified meat shield in a cheap, poorly fitted suit hired by a naive diplomat who didn't know any better. They didn't know he was born on a rock where the gravity crushes bone and the native microbes dissolve flesh for fun. When the first energy blast shattered the negotiating table, they fully expected him to die. Instead, the room fell dead silent. The gravity on Station Providence was dialed to a standard galactic 0.7. For the last 3 hours, it had been making Caleb nauseous. It wasn't a violent sickness, just a persistent, oily rolling in his gut, like stepping off a descending elevator that forgot to stop. His heavy steel-toed boots, polished to a dull, unconvincing shine, felt entirely too light. Every step required a conscious recalibration of force. Push too hard, and he'd bounce like an idiot. Don't push hard enough, and he'd drag his heels on the seamless, blindingly white polymer floors. "Mr. Hayes, please try to keep up," Sylvia said, her voice a soft, melodic chime that somehow cut right through the low-frequency hum of the station's air scrubbers. Caleb grunted, adjusting the collar of his suit. It was a terrible suit. It pinched his broad shoulders and gathered awkwardly at the waist, made of some rigid synthetic fiber that didn't breathe. He could feel a cold prickle of sweat forming at the base of his neck. "Right behind you, ma'am," he muttered. His voice was gravelly, ruined by years of breathing unfiltered industrial smog back in Detroit, a stark contrast to the acoustic perfection of the hallway. Sylvia glided ahead of him. She was an ambassador for the core systems, a species that looked remarkably human if you ignored the slightly elongated limbs, the faint iridescent shimmer of her skin under the harsh artificial lights, and the fact that her resting heart rate was probably a calm 40 beats per minute. To her, Caleb was a charity case, a local hire from a newly charted rim world called Earth. The Galactic Registry hadn't fully processed his planet's ecological classification yet. To Sylvia, Earth was just another dirtball trying to scrape together enough trade credits to afford a hyperlane relay. She hired him because human labor was dirt cheap, and he was tall enough to look imposing standing behind a chair. "The delegation from the northern sectors will be agitated," Sylvia said, not turning around. Her heels clicked in a sharp, rhythmic staccato. Tap, tap, tap. "Lord August is not known for his patience. I need you to remain entirely neutral, Mr. Hayes. No sudden movements, no defensive posturing. The core systems negotiate through intellect, not intimidation. You are here merely to satisfy the security quorum." "Neutral. Got it," Caleb said. He inhaled slowly, trying to filter out the aggressively sterile smell of the station. It smelled like bleach, ozone, and fake pine. It lacked the damp, chaotic stench of Earth, the smell of wet asphalt, rotting leaves, and exhaust fumes. He missed the dirt. The pristine cleanliness of Providence made his skin crawl. It felt like a hospital ward masquerading as a palace. They approached a set of massive, brushed steel doors. 2 guards stood on either side, clad in form-fitting ceremonial armor that looked more like polished glass than actual protection. They belonged to Lord August's retinue. They were tall, whip-thin, with pale, almost translucent skin and dark, depthless eyes. Caleb felt their gaze slide over him. He saw the microscopic curl of their upper lips, disgust, dismissal, To them, Caleb was a primitive ape squeezed into a monkey suit. He didn't care. His knuckles ached, an old barroom fracture acting up in the low atmospheric pressure. And he just wanted to get through the next 4 hours so he could go back to his cramped bunk, drink a tepid synthetic beer, and sleep. "Ambassador Sylvia," the guard on the left hissed. His voice sounded like dry leaves scraping across pavement. "Lord August awaits." "Thank you," Sylvia said, offering a serene, practiced smile. The heavy doors parted with a soft, pneumatic sigh. A rush of cold air spilled into the hallway, smelling faintly of sulfur and expensive aromatic oils. Caleb stepped in behind her, letting his eyes adjust to the dim amber lighting of the summit chamber. He let his shoulders slump just a fraction, falling into the invisible, forgettable posture of a background extra. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a patriot. He was a guy collecting 200 credits a day to stand still. But as he crossed the threshold, the hairs on his forearms stood up, scratching against the tight sleeves of his jacket. The air in the room felt heavy. Not physically, but with a taut, vibrating tension that made the back of his teeth ache. Caleb didn't know much about galactic politics. He didn't care about trade tariffs or the price of raw hypercoils. But he knew violence. He had grown up in it, swam in it, survived it, and right now, the sterile, amber-lit room reeked of it. The summit chamber was a circular amphitheater of black glass and polished obsidian, designed to make anyone standing in the center feel profoundly isolated. Sylvia took her seat at a curved desk at the bottom of the sunken room. Caleb stood exactly 3 paces behind her right shoulder, crossing his hands in front of his waist. Across the room, sitting elevated on a tiered platform, was Lord August. August was a striking figure, draped in layers of heavy crimson fabric that pooled around his spindly legs. His face was sharp, angular, and perpetually locked in an expression of bored condescension. Flanking him were 4 more of the glass-armored guards, standing with the rigid stillness of statues. "Ambassador," August said, leaning forward. His voice was amplified by the room's acoustics, echoing like a gavel strike. "You try my patience by arriving exactly on time. I prefer those who seek my favor to arrive early." "I seek only a fair resolution for the mining colonies, Lord August," Sylvia replied smoothly. She didn't flinch, though Caleb could see the faint tremor in her delicate hands where they rested on the black glass desk. "The blockade is starving millions. The core systems will not tolerate a manufactured famine." "The core systems are far away," August sneered, waving a long, multi-jointed hand. "And the colonies failed to meet their quotas. A lesson must be taught." Caleb tuned out the dialogue. It was the same old song, rich men starving poor men over numbers on a ledger. Instead, he started mapping the room. It was an old instinct, ingrained from his time doing security for black market water merchants in the ruins of Los Angeles. Look for the exits, count the hostels, check the sightlines. 2 doors, the one we came through, and a service hatch behind August's podium. 4 guards on the floor, 2 more up in the observation balcony. Caleb shifted his weight, his heavy boots making a soft thud on the carpet. The sound was swallowed by the vastness of the room, but one of the guards near August twitched. Caleb narrowed his eyes. He watched the guard. The pale, thin alien wasn't looking at Sylvia. He was looking at the ceiling. Slowly, Caleb let his gaze drift upward. The observation balcony was cloaked in shadows, but the faint crimson glow of a security camera was visibly panning back and forth. Whir, click, whir, click, until it stopped. The little red light flickered and died. Caleb's heart gave a slow, heavy thump against his ribs. He swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. He looked back at August. The Lord was still talking, his voice rising in theatrical outrage, but his eyes were darting nervously toward the service hatch. They're stalling, Caleb realized. The nausea in his stomach vanished, replaced by a cold, familiar spike of adrenaline. The air suddenly felt too thin. He could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of a cooling vent above them. He could smell the sudden, sharp spike of pheromones coming from August's side of the room. A sour, acidic tang. Fear. August was afraid. Why would the predator be afraid? Unless he wasn't the predator. Unless he had just let the real predators into the room. Ambassador Sylvia, August said, his voice suddenly dropping an octave. He stood up, gathering his crimson robes. I find this discussion entirely fruitless. I think we are done here. Lord August, wait, Sylvia stood, reaching out a hand. If you leave this table, the core systems will impose sanctions. You cannot. Ma'am, Caleb said. His voice was low, rough, and urgent. Sylvia blinked, startled by the breach in protocol. She turned her head slightly to look at him. Mr. Hayes, be quiet. You do not speak. Ma'am, we need to leave. Now, Caleb said. He didn't wait for her permission. He stepped forward, grabbing her by the elbow. Sylvia gasped, recoiling from his touch as if he had burned her. Her skin was incredibly soft, fragile beneath his calloused, scarred fingers. What are you doing? Let go of me. The cameras are dead, Caleb hissed, his eyes locked on the service hatch behind August's empty chair. The Lord was practically sprinting for the exit, his guards moving to cover his retreat. Before Sylvia could formulate a reprimand, the lights in the chamber violently snapped off. Total darkness. For a fraction of a second, the room was suspended in an awful, suffocating silence. Then, a high-pitched electronic squeal pierced the air. The kinetic barrier, a shimmering invisible field that separated the negotiation floor from the upper tiers, shattered with a sound like tearing metal. The smell of ozone grew overwhelmingly thick. Flash. A brilliant, blinding streak of blue plasma illuminated the dark. It scorched the air, searing a path directly through the space where Sylvia's chest had been a millisecond prior. She wasn't there because Caleb had already moved. He didn't execute a flawless, trained takedown. It wasn't graceful. It was a panicked, brute force collision. He threw his 220-pound frame directly into Sylvia's back. He heard the breath explode from her lungs in a sharp gasp as they hit the floor. His knee slammed into the unyielding obsidian of the floorboards, sending a sickening jolt of pain up his thigh. A second plasma bolt shattered the black glass desk, showering them in burning shards. Caleb groaned, rolling over to cover Sylvia's trembling body with his own. His cheap suit jacket sizzled where a fragment of hot glass embedded itself in the shoulder. "Stay down!" He roared over the deafening crackle of energy weapons. "They're trying to kill us!" Sylvia screamed, her diplomatic composure shattering into pure raw terror. She was clutching her head, her delicate fingers tangled in her hair. "Yeah, I picked up on that," Caleb grunted, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the floor. He had bitten his tongue when they fell. The metallic taste of copper flooded his mouth. He looked up through the darkness, relying on the strobing flashes of plasma fire to assess the room. 4 figures were dropping from the observation balcony. They weren't August's guards. They were massive, clad in heavy, light-absorbing tactical gear. Mercenaries, assassins. They hit the ground with soft, hydraulic thuds. They moved with terrifying speed, spreading out to flank the shattered desk. Caleb realized instantly that they were trapped. There was no cover. The doors were sealed. They had mere seconds before the assassins closed the circle and executed them like dogs in a pit. He looked down at Sylvia. She was staring at him, her wide, luminescent eyes filled with the absolute certainty of her own death. She was a being of intellect, of words and treaties. She had no defense against the savage, kinetic reality of the universe. Caleb felt a deep, ugly sigh rattle in his chest. He hated this job. He pushed himself off her, his joints popping, muscles screaming against the sudden exertion. "Don't move," he commanded. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't have one. Providence Station regulations expressly forbade bodyguards from carrying firearms. He was supposed to be a deterrent, not a combatant. But Earth humans didn't need firearms to be dangerous. The first assassin rounded the corner of the broken desk, raising a sleek, silent plasma rifle. The strobing lights caught the matte black helmet, reflecting nothing. Caleb didn't retreat. He didn't dive for cover. He lunged forward. The gravity of the station, the same 0.7 G that had been making him sick all morning, suddenly became his greatest asset. Without the oppressive, crushing pull of Earth anchoring him down, Caleb moved with a terrifying, explosive velocity that defied the assassin's targeting subroutines. He crossed the 10 feet between them in a single, desperate bound. The assassin fired. The bolt grazed Caleb's ribs, singing the fabric of his shirt and blistering the skin underneath. It hurt like a motherfucker, a searing white-hot line of agony, but Caleb was already drowning in adrenaline. His brain registered the pain, cataloged it, and buried it under a tidal wave of survival instinct. He slammed into the assassin like a runaway freight train. The impact was devastating. The alien mercenary, expecting a frail, low-density target, was entirely unprepared for the sheer, ridiculous kinetic mass of a human being. They crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs. Caleb felt the alien's armor crack beneath his forearm. It felt like punching through a sheet of ice. The mercenary thrashed incredibly fast, whipping a serrated combat knife from its belt. The blade slashed upward, aiming for Caleb's throat. Caleb jerked his head back, feeling the wind of the blade on his chin. He reached out with a meaty, calloused hand, grabbing the assassin's wrist. He squeezed. On Earth, a human's grip strength is necessary to hold on to tools, to pull their heavy bodies up cliffs, to survive a gravity well that constantly tries to crush them into the dirt. To a species evolved on a lighter, gentler world, that grip was an industrial hydraulic press. The alien's wrist snapped with a loud, wet crack. The mercenary let out a horrific, high-pitched shriek. The knife clattered to the floor. Caleb didn't stop. He was operating purely on the ugly, reptilian part of his brain. He dragged the screaming alien up by the tactical vest, hauling him to his feet like a rag doll, and used him as a meat shield just as the second assassin opened fire. 3 plasma bolts thumped solidly into the first mercenary's back. The body jerked violently against Caleb. Caleb shoved the dead weight forward, throwing the corpse into the second assassin. The mercenary stumbled backward, his rifle waving wildly. Caleb snatched the dropped combat knife from the floor. He didn't throw it. He rushed the stumbling mercenary, his heavy boots tearing up the expensive synthetic carpet. The alien tried to bring his rifle to bear, but Caleb was already inside his guard. He drove his shoulder into the alien's chest, pinning him against the obsidian wall. The wall cracked in a spiderweb pattern. Caleb felt something give way in his own shoulder, a hot, tearing sensation in his rotator cuff. But he ignored it. He drove the serrated knife up under the gap in the mercenary's helmet, right where the chin met the neck. Warm, purplish fluid sprayed across Caleb's knuckles. It smelled like ammonia and burnt sugar. The second assassin slumped against the wall, dead. Caleb spun around, panting heavily. The air in his lungs felt like glass. Sweat was pouring down his face, mixing with the dirt and the alien blood on his hands. The remaining two assassins had frozen. They stood near the center of the room, their weapons raised, but their fingers hesitated on the triggers. They were looking at Caleb, their helmets tilting slightly. They couldn't understand what they were seeing. By all galactic metrics, the fleshy biped in the ruined suit should be dead. A grazing shot from a plasma rifle should have sent him into deep systemic shock. The physical exertion of shattering a tactical vest and snapping a combatant's arm should have torn his own muscles from the bone. They didn't know about Earth. They didn't know about the brutal evolutionary arms race of a Class 9 Deathworld. They didn't know that Caleb's skeletal structure was incredibly dense, that his muscle fibers were bundled tight like steel cables, or that his adrenal glands were currently pumping a chemical cocktail that made him temporarily numb to fear and pain. To them, Caleb was a monster wrapped in a cheap polyester suit. "Come on!" Caleb roared. His voice cracked, raw and bleeding, echoing off the high ceiling. He dropped the knife. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the violent, unspent energy coursing through his veins. He raised his fists, adopting a sloppy, exhausted boxer's stance. "Who's next?" The third assassin took a step back. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but in the dim, strobing light of the ruined chamber, it was profound. It was the universal body language of prey, realizing it had picked the wrong fight. Before the assassins could decide whether to fire or flee, the heavy steel doors of the chamber blew inward. Station security poured into the room, their heavy stun rifles leveled. "Drop your weapons! Stand down!" A synthesized voice boomed over a loudspeaker. The two mercenaries looked at the dozen security officers, then at the blood-soaked humans standing over their dead comrades. Slowly, they lowered their rifles and raised their hands. The red emergency lights flickered on, casting the ruined chamber in a harsh, bloody glow. Caleb let out a long, shuddering breath. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a cold, trembling exhaustion. His shoulder screamed in agony. His ribs felt like they had been hit by a sledgehammer. He swayed slightly, blinking the sweat out of his eyes. He turned around slowly. Sylvia was still on the floor, surrounded by shattered black glass. She was completely unharmed, though her pristine robes were covered in dust. She was staring up at Caleb. Her mouth was slightly parted. Her luminescent eyes were wide, taking in the bruised, bleeding, sweating human standing before her. She looked at the dead assassins. She looked at the wall Caleb had cracked with a man's body. The room fell completely, utterly silent. The chaotic noise of the firefight was gone, replaced only by the ragged, wet sound of Caleb trying to catch his breath. He reached into his pocket, his bloody fingers fumbling, and pulled out a crumpled, remarkably clean handkerchief. He offered it to her. "You okay, ma'am?" Caleb croaked, forcing a tired, lopsided smile. "Told you the local hires were worth the credits." The station's infirmary smelled deeply offensive. It was a sterile, chemical stench that reminded Caleb of rotting kelp soaked in rubbing alcohol. He sat on the edge of a freezing, stainless steel diagnostic bed, shivering. The adrenaline had finally bled out of his system, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep cold. Every muscle in his body felt like it had been stretched over a rusted winch. His right shoulder throbbed with a dull, rhythmic heat, and his ribs screamed every time he took a breath deeper than a shallow gasp. A medical drone, a hovering sphere of polished chrome and blinking blue lights, buzzed around his torso. It kept trying to spray a layer of synthetic biogel over the plasma burn on his side, but Caleb kept swatting it away. "I said knock it off," Caleb growled, his voice a hoarse rasp. He shoved the drone back. It whirred angrily, its internal gyroscopes clicking as it restabilized. "Mr. Hayes, please let the machine work. The plasma searing requires immediate dermal reconstruction." Sylvia stepped into his line of sight. She had cleaned up. The dust from the shattered obsidian floor was gone from her robes, and her iridescent skin was back to its flawless, pearlescent shimmer. But her eyes, wide, dark, and utterly exhausted, betrayed the pristine facade. She stood near the foot of the bed, keeping a very deliberate distance. It was the kind of distance you keep from a caged animal when you aren't entirely sure the lock is going to hold. "I don't want the gel," Caleb said, leaning forward and resting his heavy forearms on his knees. He stared at the floor, watching a drop of his own blood dry on the pristine white polymer. "It numbs the skin, but it makes the muscle tissue underneath itch like crazy. Just wrap it in gauze and give me some ibuprofen." "Ibuprofen?" Sylvia frowned, her brow furrowing slightly. "The station formulary does not stock primitive analgesics. The drone is attempting to administer a localized nerve block. Why would you choose to feel the pain?" Caleb finally looked up at her. He offered a tired, lopsided smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Pain means the nerves aren't dead, means I'm still breathing. Besides, nerve blocks mess with my reaction time. If August's guys find us in here, I don't want to be fighting them with half my torso asleep." Sylvia flinched at the mention of Lord August. She crossed her arms, a rare defensive posture for a diplomat trained to project total openness. "We are in the secure wing," she said, though she didn't sound entirely convinced. "Providence Security has locked down the entire quadrant. Inspector Davies has assured me that Lord August's transport was impounded before it could leave the docking bay." "Yeah, and Davies was probably the one who shut off the cameras in the negotiation room," Caleb muttered. He reached down, wincing as his ribs shifted, and grabbed his ruined suit jacket off the floor. He fished a crushed, half-empty pack of cigarettes from the inside pocket. He put one between his lips, then remembered he was in a highly oxygenated medical bay. He cursed quietly, pulling it out and rolling it between his calloused fingers, just to have something to do with his hands. "You think the station authorities are compromised?" Sylvia asked softly. "Ma'am, I think an ambush that involves disabling kinetic barriers, blinding security feeds, and smuggling military-grade plasma rifles into a diplomatic summit doesn't happen without the local cops turning a blind eye." Caleb sighed, running a hand through his sweat-matted hair. "Who else is on August's payroll? Because right now, I don't trust a single badge on this floating tin can." The infirmary doors slid open with a soft hiss. Both Caleb and Sylvia tensed. Caleb's hand instinctively dropped to his side, searching for the combat knife he had left embedded in the assassin's neck back in the chamber. He gripped the edge of the metal bed instead, ready to throw it. It was just the station doctor. He was a human, or close enough to pass for one in dim lighting. An older man with thinning gray hair and a tired slump to his shoulders. His name tag read, Dr. Cole. Cole walked over to the diagnostic console next to Caleb's bed, pulled up a holographic display, and immediately took off his glasses to rub the bridge of his nose. "You broke my scanner," Cole said flatly. "Sorry," Caleb grunted. "Your table is too cold anyway." "Not the bed, the deep tissue resonator." Cole put his glasses back on and stared at Caleb like he was a frustrating math problem. "The machine hit your skeletal structure and threw a calibration error. It registered your bone density as a localized heavy metal deposit, and your muscle fiber. Christ, son, the tensile strain on your tendons right now would snap a Curian in half. How are you even sitting upright?" "Stubbornness," Caleb said, "and the promise of a paycheck." He looked at Sylvia. "Speaking of which, am I fired? Because technically, I broke protocol. You told me not to make any sudden movements." Sylvia stared at him. For a long, silent moment, the diplomat looked completely lost for words. Her mouth parted, then closed. She looked at his bruised, battered face, down to the ugly, weeping burn on his side, and then back up to his eyes. "You," she started, her voice barely a whisper. "You broke a mercenary's arm with your bare hands. You drove a man through a solid obsidian retaining wall. You absorbed a kinetic impact that should have liquefied your internal organs. And you are asking me if you are fired?" "I signed a contract," Caleb said simply. "I need the credits." Sylvia shook her head, a slow, bewildered motion. She turned to the doctor. "Dr. Cole, please give us a moment, and do not log Mr. Hayes' biometric data into the station mainframe. Keep it entirely off the network." Cole looked between the two of them, recognized the hard edge in the diplomat's tone, and nodded. "I'll go synthesize a traditional bandage. Try not to bleed on the floor." He turned and walked out, the doors sealing shut behind him. The room fell quiet, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the life support vents. Sylvia stepped closer. The fear in her eyes hadn't vanished, but it had shifted. It was no longer the blind, panicking terror of the ambush. It was a sharp, calculating apprehension. She was looking at Caleb not as a bodyguard, but as an unknown variable. "I pulled your file from the local registry while you were unconscious," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense murmur. "I wanted to know what kind of anomaly I had hired." Caleb stopped rolling the unlit cigarette. He looked up at her, his face completely unreadable. "And?" he asked. "Your homeworld," she said. "Earth. The registry flagged it pending a final ecological review, but the preliminary data was attached. It classified the planet as a Class 9 Deathworld." Caleb said nothing. He just waited. "I thought it was a clerical error," Sylvia continued, her voice trembling slightly. "A Class 9 designation means the planet's gravity is oppressive. It means the tectonic plates are aggressively volatile. It means the native flora and fauna are trapped in a perpetual, hyper-lethal evolutionary arms race. Sentient life is not supposed to develop on a Class 9. It is statistically impossible. The environment should crush it before it can build tools." Well, Caleb said, his voice dry as cracked earth, we're a very stubborn species. Sylvia didn't laugh. She moved to the small, sterile counter across from the biobed and leaned against it, wrapping her arms around herself. The bright, unforgiving lights of the infirmary cast sharp shadows under her cheekbones. I don't understand, she whispered. She sounded genuinely distressed, the foundations of her heavily structured, logical universe cracking under the weight of the man sitting in front of her. The core systems prioritize harmony. We engineer our environments. We smooth the edges of our worlds. How do you live in a place that is actively trying to kill you every second of the day? Caleb swung his heavy boots over the edge of the bed. The metal protested with a sharp squeak. He rested his elbows on his knees again, staring at his hands. His knuckles were swollen, the skin split and stained with dried, purplish alien blood that wouldn't wash off. You don't think about it, he said quietly. It's just life. You learn how to walk so you don't fall. Because if you fall on Earth, the ground doesn't give. You break bones. You learn to check your boots for things that sting and bite, because half the bugs back home carry venom that'll rot your flesh off. You learn to read the sky because a storm can spin up in an hour and tear your house to splinters. He looked up at her. He didn't want to sound dramatic. He wasn't trying to scare her. He was just tired, and the truth was the easiest thing to carry. It's not glorious, ma'am. It's exhausting. You spend your whole life fighting the dirt, the weather, the microbes. It makes you dense, makes you heavy. He tapped his chest, right over his heart. Not just the bones, the mind too. You have to be a little bit mean just to survive. Sylvia swallowed hard. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. When the assassins dropped from the balcony, she said, her voice unsteady, you didn't even hesitate. You moved, faster than my eyes could track. It was violence in its most distilled form. It was panic, Caleb corrected her softly. Down there, on the floor, I was terrified. You didn't look terrified. You looked like you were exactly where you belonged. That stung. Caleb felt a hot, uncomfortable prickle of shame rise in his chest. He hated that look in her eyes. He had seen it before, back on Earth. The look people gave a loaded gun sitting on a table. Useful, dangerous, not entirely human. I'm not a killer, Ambassador, Caleb said, his voice hardening slightly. I did a stint in corporate security. I guarded water shipments. I hit people who tried to steal from us, and I got hit back. But I never enjoyed it. What happened in that room? That was muscle memory. The gravity here is light. My body overcompensated. I broke that guy's arm because I didn't know my own strength without the earth pulling me down. Sylvia slowly walked over to him. She stopped just out of arm's reach. She reached into the folds of her pristine robe and pulled out a small, flat data pad. The core systems negotiation doctrine states that if a variable changes, the contract must be restructured, she said. Her voice was returning to its melodic, diplomatic cadence, but there was a new, raw edge to it, a desperation. What are you saying? Caleb asked. I hired a deterrent, a visual aid to make the delegation look secure, Sylvia said, looking directly into his eyes. I was a fool. I brought a blunted ceremonial sword to a gunfight. Lord August knows I survived. He knows his mercenaries failed. He will not let me leave Providence Station alive, Caleb sighed, rubbing a hand roughly over his face. He felt the coarse stubble on his jaw. So, we call the core systems. We get an extraction team. Communication relays have been jammed for the last hour, Sylvia said flatly. A maintenance error in the station's main comms array. We are entirely cut off. Caleb's stomach dropped. The oily, nauseating feeling from earlier returned, but this time it had nothing to do with the artificial gravity. It was the sudden, sharp realization of being trapped. They were two people on a station filled with millions, and they were completely alone. Davies, the security inspector, told me to stay in the secure wing, Sylvia continued. He said he would send an escort to move us to a safe house in the lower levels in 30 minutes. He's lying, Caleb said instantly. He stood up. The sudden movement sent a fresh wave of agony through his shoulder, but he forced it down. If August has the comms and the cameras, he has the cops. Davies isn't sending an escort, he's sending a cleanup crew. Sylvia's breath hitched. Are you certain? I've survived 30 years on a Class 9 Deathworld, Sylvia, Caleb said, dropping the formal ma'am. I know what a trap smells like. He grabbed his ruined jacket off the bed and shoved his left arm through the sleeve, wincing as he draped the right side over his bad shoulder. He walked over to the medical tray where Dr. Cole had left his belongings. He picked up his shattered comlink, his wallet, and a heavy metal oxygen canister that looked about the size of a baseball bat. He weighed the canister in his hand. It wasn't a knife, but it was solid steel. It would dent an alien skull just fine. We have to move, Caleb said, turning back to her. Now. Sylvia didn't argue. The pristine, untouchable diplomat who had floated through the corridors mere hours ago was gone. In her place was a woman who had just realized the universe was a profoundly ugly place, and her only shield was the battered, bleeding human standing in front of her. Where do we go? She asked. Down, Caleb said, his eyes scanning the infirmary doors. Away from the polished floors and the clean air. We go into the maintenance shafts, the vents, the places where the station's dirt hides. Lord August's guys won't like it down there. And you? She asked softly. Caleb gripped the steel canister tighter. He felt the familiar, ugly spike of adrenaline beginning to pool in his gut again. The primal, violent engine waking up. Me? Caleb said, a dark, cynical shadow crossing his exhausted face. I love the dirt. Let's go. The maintenance access hatch was bolted shut. 6 heavy industrial hex screws held the rusted iron grate to the wall behind the infirmary's sterilization units. Caleb didn't have a wrench. He had the heavy steel oxygen canister. Step back, he muttered. Sylvia pressed herself against the pristine white polymer wall, her iridescent eyes wide in the harsh fluorescent lighting. Caleb wedged the rounded lip of the canister behind the edge of the grate. He planted his boots, gritted his teeth, and leaned his entire body weight into the makeshift lever. The metal shrieked. It was a terrible, high-pitched tearing sound. On Earth, ripping a bolted iron grate from a reinforced wall would require power tools or a forklift. Here, the sheer density of Caleb's muscle mass, combined with the station's lower gravity, turned his body into a battering ram. The first 2 bolts sheared off with a sharp crack, pinging against the floor tiles like bullets. Pain flared across his ribs, white-hot and blinding. He tasted copper. He ignored it, shifting his grip and throwing his weight backward again. The remaining bolts groaned, deformed, and finally snapped. The heavy grate fell outward. Caleb caught it before it could crash to the floor, his biceps bulging beneath his torn, bloody shirt, and gently lowered it silently to the tiles. Beyond the opening lay a square shaft, dropping into absolute suffocating darkness. A wave of hot, stale air rolled out of the hole. It smelled like hydraulic grease, ozone, and old sweat. "Ladies first," Caleb wheezed, leaning heavily against the wall. Sweat dripped from his chin. Sylvia stared at the black void. The core systems did not have dark places. Their cities were bathed in perpetual, engineered twilight, clean and perfectly regulated. The maintenance shaft was a filthy, unmonitored wound in the station's architecture. "I cannot see anything in there," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Keep your hand on the left wall. Count your steps. There should be a service ladder about 10 feet down," Caleb instructed, his breath coming in shallow, ragged pulls. "Go, now." He heard them before she did. Heavy, synchronized footsteps echoing down the sterile corridor outside the infirmary. Tactical boots. Inspector Davies's cleanup crew had arrived early. Sylvia heard the metallic click of a rifle safety disengaging from the hallway. That was all the motivation she needed. She hiked up the ruined hem of her diplomatic robes and scrambled awkwardly into the dark shaft. Caleb grabbed a roll of medical gauze from the counter, shoved it into his pocket, and followed her in. He grabbed the heavy iron grate and pulled it back into place, leaving it balanced on the sheared bolts just as the infirmary doors hissed open. Through the narrow slits in the grate, Caleb watched 4 men in matte black Providence security armor flood the room. They moved with lethal, practiced efficiency, weapons raised, sweeping the corners. "Clear," one of them barked. His voice was muffled through a tactical helmet. "Bed's empty, blood on the floor." "Find them," a second voice ordered. "Davies wants the human's head. The diplomat is secondary." Caleb held his breath. He pressed his back against the cold, vibrating metal of the shaft, not daring to move an inch. A security officer walked right up to the sterilization units, his helmet light sweeping across the floor, illuminating the dropped bolts. The officer paused. He reached a gloved hand toward the grate. Caleb's fingers tightened around the steel oxygen canister. If he touches it, the grate falls. If the grate falls, I have to cave his skull in before he pulls the trigger. His heart hammered a violent, frantic rhythm against his bruised ribs. He could feel a warm bead of blood trickling slowly down his side, soaking into his waistband. "Hey, over here!" one of the other guards yelled from the hallway. "Service door to the lab wing was forced." The officer by the grate turned and jogged out of the room. The doors hissed shut, plunging the infirmary back into silence. Caleb let out a slow, shaking exhale. He turned his head into the suffocating darkness of the shaft. "You on the ladder?" he whispered. "Yes," Sylvia's voice floated up from below, tight and terrified. "Climb down, fast as you can." The descent was pure agony. The shaft was cramped, the air thick and roasting from the proximity to the station's main thermal exhaust vents. Every time Caleb reached down to grip a rung of the ladder, the torn muscles in his right shoulder screamed. His left hand was doing most of the work, his dense fingers bending the thin aluminum rung slightly with his weight. He slipped twice. His heavy boots missed the narrow footholds, and he dropped several feet, catching himself by his left arm. The jolt tore through his chest, forcing a wet, choked grunt from his throat. The low gravity saved him from a broken neck, but the sudden arrest of momentum made his vision swim with black spots. "Are you all right?" Sylvia called up. She sounded small in the echoing dark. "Just keep moving," Caleb gritted out. They climbed for what felt like hours, descending through the pristine layers of the upper station into the mechanical bowels of Providence. The smooth polymer walls transitioned to exposed piping, rusted catwalks, and massive thrumming bundles of fiber optic cables. The air grew steadily thicker, smelling heavily of bleach and damp mold. Water reclamation. Finally, Caleb's boots hit a solid metal grate. He stepped off the ladder and collapsed against a thick, vibrating condensation pipe. He slid down to the floor, his legs simply refusing to support his mass any longer. He dropped the oxygen canister. It rang against the grating with a dull, heavy thud. Dim, amber emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows across the massive, cavernous room. Giant cylindrical water tanks loomed in the gloom like slumbering iron beasts. The deafening roar of industrial water pumps masked the sound of their ragged breathing. Sylvia stood a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself. Her pristine robes were smeared with thick, black grease. Her perfect, meticulously styled hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat. She looked like a ghost that had been dragged through an engine block. She looked at Caleb, and her expression shattered. He was a mess. His cheap suit jacket was gone. His white shirt was soaked gray with sweat and plastered to his skin, heavily stained with dark, spreading patches of crimson. His face was bruised, a nasty purple swelling shutting his left eye. He looked exactly like the savage, brutal thing the galaxy thought a Deathworlder was. But his hands were shaking violently, not with adrenaline, with shock. "We stop here," Caleb rasped, his head falling back against the pipe. "They won't scan this deep. Too much metal messes with their thermals." Sylvia didn't speak. She knelt beside him, the hard metal grate digging into her knees. She reached out, her delicate fingers hovering over his bloody torso, terrified to touch him. "You are dying," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a bleak, horrified observation. "Takes a lot more than this to kill a guy from Detroit." Caleb managed a weak, ugly bark of a laugh. He dug into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled roll of medical gauze. He tossed it onto her lap. "Wrap the ribs, tight as you can. I can't reach." The physical contact was jarring. Sylvia's hands were ice cold, her skin impossibly smooth. Caleb's skin was burning with fever, rough, scarred, and coated in a slick layer of sweat and grime. She unbuttoned the ruined remains of his shirt, pushing the fabric aside. She gasped quietly. The plasma burn on his side was an angry, weeping trench of charred flesh. Underneath the burn, his ribcage was heavily mottled with dark, ugly purples and blacks. The blunt force trauma from hitting the obsidian floor and tackling the mercenaries. "This is barbaric," Sylvia murmured, her voice tight. She unrolled the gauze, her hands trembling as she passed it around his thick torso. "Your biology. It simply endures this? The pain must be blinding." "You learn to compartmentalize," Caleb grunted. He bit down on the inside of his cheek as she pulled the bandage taut. He closed his eyes, forcing his breathing to slow, overriding the panic signals firing off in his brain. Pain is just an alert system. Once you acknowledge the damage, you tell your brain to shut the alarm off. Focus on the next 10 seconds. Just 10 seconds. Then the next 10. Sylvia tied off the bandage. She sat back on her heels, her hands stained with his blood. She stared at her own palms, a profound look of dissonance in her wide eyes. "Why didn't you leave me?" she asked. The question hung in the humid, roaring air of the water reclamation room. Caleb opened his good eye. He looked at her. She wasn't an ambassador right now. She was just a terrified woman far from home. In the chamber, she clarified. When the lights went out, the core system's behavioral models dictate self-preservation above all else in an unwinnable scenario. You had no weapon. You were vastly outmatched. You could have surrendered or fled. You are a local hire, a mercenary. Why throw yourself in front of a plasma bolt for me? Caleb sighed. It was a long, rattling sound. He leaned his head back against the pipe, staring up at the rusted ceiling. I grew up in a place where the sun burns your skin and the water in the pipes makes you sick, Caleb said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly murmur. You scrape for everything. You fight for the scraps. It makes people selfish. It makes them cruel. He paused, swallowing the dry, metallic taste in his mouth. But you also learn that the only way anyone survives the dirt is if you stand between the dirt and the person standing next to you. You asked me why I didn't run. The truth? I needed the 200 credits. If I let my boss get vaporized on day one, my reputation on the job board goes to hell. Sylvia blinked. That is a lie. You did not risk your life for 200 credits. No, Caleb admitted quietly. He looked back at her, his expression entirely devoid of bravado, just a bone-deep weariness. I didn't run because I hate bullies. August sits up in his clean, high tower and starves miners because they missed a quota. He sends men in armor to kill an unarmed diplomat in the dark. I've known guys like August my whole life. Dress them up in alien silk or cheap synthetic leather. They're all the same. He shifted, wincing as the fresh bandages stretched. I'm not a hero, Ambassador. I'm just a guy who gets very, very angry when the people with power decide the people without it are disposable. Sylvia looked at him for a long time. The harsh, cynical exterior of the human didn't match the fundamental, raw decency she was witnessing. He was a creature of violence, born on a world of violence, who used that exact savagery to protect someone entirely alien to him. My name is Sylvia, she said softly. Not Ambassador, just Sylvia. Caleb offered a faint, tired smirk. Caleb. Before she could say anything else, a sharp, mechanical chirp echoed from the far side of the cavernous room. Both of them froze. The sound cut through the low roar of the water pumps. It wasn't ambient station noise. It was synthetic, intentional. Caleb's head snapped toward the noise. In the gloom, between two massive filtration tanks about 50 yards away, a small red laser swept across the rusted floor grating. A seeker drone. Davies's men hadn't found them on thermals. They had deployed localized micro-drones to map the physical layout of the shafts. They're here, Caleb breathed. The exhaustion vanished. The pain in his ribs faded into a distant, dull roar. The chemical cocktail of adrenaline and cortisol flooded his system once again, cold and sharp. He grabbed the heavy steel oxygen canister from the floor and forced himself to his feet. His knees trembled for a fraction of a second before his sheer, stubborn will locked them into place. Sylvia, Caleb said, his voice entirely different now. It was flat, hard, and terrifyingly calm. Get behind the main condensation pipe. Do not come out, no matter what you hear. Sylvia scrambled backward, pulling herself behind the thick metal casing of the machinery. Caleb, you cannot fight them in this condition. You have no armor. Caleb stepped out into the open aisle between the tanks, hefting the heavy steel cylinder in his right hand. The shadows swallowed his bruised, battered frame, leaving only the grim, unyielding set of his jaw visible in the amber emergency lights. "I don't need armor," Caleb said, staring into the dark. "I'm from Earth." The red laser of the micro-drone swept across Caleb's boots. It emitted a sharp, ascending trill, a target lock. Caleb didn't wait for the tactical team to round the massive filtration tanks. He swung his heavy steel boot, kicking the drone out of the air. It shattered against a rusted bulkhead with a crunch of cheap plastic and sparks. But the damage was done. They knew exactly where he was. Heavy, synchronized boots slapped against the iron grating. 3 figures emerged from the gloom, their black armor absorbing the dim amber emergency lights. They moved in a loose tactical wedge, assault rifles raised, sweeping the narrow aisle between the humming water tanks. They expected a terrified diplomat and a wounded fleeing bodyguard. They expected their target to be hiding behind the machinery, paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming disadvantage of the situation. They did not expect a 220-pound mass of dense bone and muscle to charge them. Caleb sprinted. In the 0.7 standard gravity of Providence Station, he didn't run so much as he bounded, his heavy boots tearing divots into the rusted grating. His ruined ribs screamed, a white-hot flare of agony that threatened to black out his vision. But the adrenaline overrode it. He was a creature born on a rock that constantly tried to crush him. Taking the gravity away just let the monster off the leash. The point man saw the movement and raised his rifle, his finger pulling the trigger. Thwump, thwump. 2 bolts of blue plasma seared through the damp air, missing Caleb's shoulder by inches and leaving a smell like burnt hair and copper in their wake. Before the mercenary could adjust his aim, Caleb threw the heavy steel oxygen canister. He didn't toss it. He hurled it with the brutal, violent torque of a baseball pitcher. The solid steel cylinder crossed the 20 feet between them in a fraction of a second. It caught the point man dead in the center of his chest. The kinetic impact was horrific. The heavy tactical armor cracked like thin ice. The alien sternum collapsed with a sickening, wet crunch, and he was thrown backward off his feet, dead before his helmet hit the floor. The remaining 2 mercenaries froze. It was only a half-second of hesitation, the shock of seeing their squad leader completely crushed by a piece of flying debris. But on a Deathworld, a half-second was a lifetime. Caleb closed the distance. He hit the second mercenary low, driving his good shoulder directly into the alien's waist. They crashed into the curved steel side of the filtration tank. Caleb heard the breath explode from the mercenary's lungs. The alien thrashed, dropping his rifle and clawing wildly at Caleb's back, his gauntlets tearing into the bloody remnants of Caleb's shirt. Caleb didn't let up. He grabbed the mercenary by the tactical vest, planted his feet, and threw his entire upper body weight backward, pulling the alien away from the tank and slamming him face first into the iron floor grating. The heavy thud vibrated through Caleb's boots. The mercenary went limp. The third alien backed away, pure panic overriding his training. He brought his rifle up, his hands shaking violently. He wasn't aiming. He just pulled the trigger and held it down. A wild spray of plasma bolts chewed the cavern to pieces. They hit the water tank, the rusted floor, the ceiling. One of the bolts clipped a high-pressure condensation line running just above Caleb's head. The pipe ruptured with an ear-splitting shriek. Boiling, high-pressure steam violently erupted into the aisle, filling the space with a thick, scalding white fog. Caleb dropped to the floor, rolling away from the blistering heat. The steam cooked the damp air instantly. It smelled like bleach and hot iron. He pressed his face against the cold, wet grating, gasping for breath. His left eye was completely swollen shut now. His chest felt like it was full of broken glass. Every frantic heartbeat pumped a fresh wave of nausea into his throat. "Get up," his brain ordered. "If you stay down, you die." Through the deafening hiss of the ruptured pipe, he heard the third mercenary coughing. The alien was blind in the steam, backing away blindly, his boots scraping frantically against the metal floor. Caleb didn't stand. He crawled. He dragged his battered body across the grating, moving under the thickest layer of the scalding fog. He was a predator in the tall grass, relying on the primal, ugly instincts that had kept his ancestors alive when the sky was dark and the woods were full of teeth. He saw the mercenary's boots. Caleb lunged upward. He grabbed the barrel of the plasma rifle, violently jerking it sideways just as the alien pulled the trigger. The bolt blew a hole in a nearby electrical conduit, showering them in a cascade of blue sparks. Caleb drove his forehead directly into the center of the mercenary's helmet. The impact cracked Caleb's skull, a blinding flash of stars exploding behind his eyes, but the heavy glass visor of the alien's helmet shattered inward. The mercenary screamed, dropping the gun and clutching his face. Caleb shoved him backward. The alien tripped over the rusted lip of the floor grating and fell hard, his head striking the edge of the machinery housing with a dull, heavy clatter. He didn't get back up. Silence rushed back into the room, broken only by the angry, relentless hiss of the ruptured steam pipe and the heavy, ragged sound of Caleb's own breathing. He stood there for a moment in the swirling white fog, swaying on his feet. His hands were covered in cuts and bruises, slick with the purple blood of the men he had just killed. He looked down at his own chest. The makeshift gauze bandage Sylvia had tied for him was completely soaked through with his own crimson blood. The adrenaline was crashing. He could feel it draining out of him, leaving behind a cold, hollow void. His knees buckled. He reached out, grabbing the cold metal side of the filtration tank to keep himself from collapsing. He was entirely spent. There was nothing left in the tank. If another squad walked through the doors right now, they wouldn't even need to shoot him. They could just push him over. "Caleb!" The voice was small, cutting through the thick steam. Sylvia emerged from behind the heavy machinery. Her pristine, iridescent skin was smudged with black grease and soot. Her elegant robes were torn and soaked with condensation. But she wasn't cowering. She walked past the bodies of the mercenaries. She didn't flinch at the sight of their broken armor or the dark pools of fluid spreading across the floor. She walked straight to Caleb. She slid under his arm, wrapping her arms around his waist and taking his heavy, suffocating weight onto her own slender shoulders. "I've got you," she whispered. Caleb leaned heavily against her, his breath rattling in his ruined chest. "You were supposed to stay hidden." "The core systems adapt to new data," Sylvia said, her voice surprisingly steady. The data suggested that hiding was no longer a viable strategy. She helped him limp away from the hissing steam pipe, moving toward the far wall of the cavern, where a small, blinking yellow console was bolted to the rusted metal. It was a maintenance terminal, an ancient piece of hardware used to manually flush the station's water lines. Sylvia lowered Caleb to the floor. He sat hard against the bulkhead, his head falling back against the cold steel. His skin was pale, a sickly grayish white beneath the dirt and the bruises. The fire in his eyes was dying down to embers. Sylvia knelt beside the dead squad leader. She didn't hesitate. She reached into the shattered remnants of his tactical vest and pulled out his heavy, military-grade comms unit. It was still blinking with a green connection light. It operated on a localized, encrypted tactical frequency, completely bypassing the station's jammed civilian relays. She walked back to the maintenance console. She plugged the comms unit directly into the terminal's diagnostic port. Her delicate, long fingers flew across the physical keyboard, her mind working with the terrifying, cold efficiency of a core systems diplomat. What are you doing?" Caleb managed to ask, coughing weakly. "Lord August believes he is dealing with a polite, civilized species," Sylvia said, not looking away from the screen. "He believes that if he kills the ambassador, the core systems will drown in bureaucratic debates for 6 months before taking action. He believes we are soft." The terminal screen flashed green. She had bypassed the encryption. She now had a direct line not just to Inspector Davies, but to the bridge of Lord August's impounded transport ship. Sylvia tapped a button, opening a station-wide broadcast on the tactical frequency. "Lord August," Sylvia's voice echoed into the small microphone. It was no longer the melodic, accommodating chime of a negotiator. It was ice. It was the sound of a scalpel cutting through flesh. "This is Ambassador Sylvia of the Core Systems. I am broadcasting from the lower reclamation deck." There was a long stretch of static. Then a voice crackled through the speaker. It wasn't August. It was Inspector Davies, sounding panicked. "Ambassador, the lower decks are unsafe. My men are down there trying to locate you. You need to—" "Your men are dead, Inspector," Sylvia cut him off. The absolute certainty in her voice made the radio fall dead silent. "Your squad leader is dead. Your assassins in the summit chamber are dead. The perimeter you thought you secured is broken." More static. Then the arrogant, velvet voice of Lord August came through the speaker. He sounded strained. "Ambassador, a tragic misunderstanding. Rogue elements within the station security force—" "Save your breath, August," Sylvia snapped. Caleb opened his good eye, watching her. He had never seen a core systems alien look so furious. She was magnificent. "You brought violence to a diplomatic table because you thought there would be no consequences. You underestimated the environment." She paused, looking down at Caleb. She looked at his bleeding ribs, his shattered hands, the sheer, impossible stubbornness that kept his heart beating. "You thought you were the apex predator on this station," Sylvia continued, her voice echoing through the dark, cavernous room. "You are not. I hired a human, a native of a Class 9 Deathworld. He just tore your elite security detail apart with his bare hands and a piece of scrap metal, and he is very, very angry." Caleb let out a weak, breathy chuckle. It hurt to laugh, but he couldn't help it. She was bluffing perfectly. "The core systems fleet has already received my encrypted distress pulse," Sylvia lied, her tone dripping with absolute conviction. "They will arrive in Providence space in exactly 12 minutes. When they do, they will not be opening negotiations. They will be opening fire. Unless you surrender your transport, your codes, and your personnel to the local authorities immediately." Silence stretched over the comms. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. The silence of a predator realizing it had just walked into a trap. "Do you understand me, Lord August?" Sylvia demanded. "Or should I send the human up to the docking bay to explain it to you in person?" The radio clicked. We are powering down our weapons, August's voice trembled. The arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by the hollow rattle of total defeat. We surrender. Please, keep him down there. Sylvia reached out and severed the connection. The maintenance terminal went dark. She let out a long, shuddering breath, her shoulders dropping. The icy Diplomat vanished, leaving only a profoundly exhausted woman in ruined robes. She turned around and slid down the wall, sitting on the cold grating next to Caleb. For a long time, the only sound was the low, rhythmic thrumming of the water pumps. "Nice speech," Caleb rasped, turning his head slightly to look at her. "You lie pretty good for a politician." "I am a diplomat," Sylvia corrected softly, staring out into the dark. "We do not lie. We merely curate the truth to achieve the best possible outcome." She reached out, her cool, smooth hand finding Caleb's heavy, bruised fingers. She didn't pull away from the blood or the grime. She squeezed his hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "You are going to live, Caleb," she said, looking him directly in the eyes. It wasn't a comforting platitude, it was an order. "The station medical teams are coming down here now that the lockdown is lifted. You are going to live. You owe me." "I owe you?" Caleb wheezed, a faint smile touching the corner of his bloody mouth. "Pretty sure I just saved your life, boss." "You did," Sylvia nodded, her luminescent eyes reflecting the amber emergency lights. "But you also ruined my favorite robes, and the core system's doctrine dictates that all debts must be repaid, so you will recover, and then you will remain on my staff, with a substantial raise, of course." Caleb closed his eyes, the cold metal of the floor finally feeling comfortable. The crushing weight of the adrenaline was gone, leaving behind the simple, quiet certainty that he had survived another day in the dark. "Yeah," Caleb whispered, his breathing finally slowing down. "I could use the credits." He didn't know much about galactic politics. He didn't care about trade tariffs, but as he drifted into the heavy, welcoming pull of unconsciousness, Caleb thought that maybe the galaxy wasn't so different from Earth after all. It was still a dangerous, ugly place, but as long as there was someone willing to stand between the dirt and the dark, it was a place worth surviving. What a ride. If you loved watching Caleb turn a hopeless ambush into a masterclass on Deathworld survival, do me a massive favor and smash that like button. It tells the algorithm you want more gritty, HFY sci-fi stories just like this one. Share this video with your sci-fi loving friends, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new upload. The universe is a dangerous place, but humanity always hits back harder.